Hi, this is Reverend Dr. Nadine Rosechild-Sullivan. I am an interfaith minister and a spiritual counselor. I'm also a sociologist teaching issues of gender and sexuality, race and ethnicity. And so I come to you tonight bringing kind of a dual perspective, both about where we are as a country and about how we can help create the society we desire. So if you'll go with me for just a moment tonight, I want you to think about where we are in this particular moment in time. As I sit here tonight, over 43 states have tried to pass over 250 laws to further suppress the vote in the United States of America. Voting is absolutely foundational to being a democracy. Without the vote, or when our vote is suppressed, we become no longer a democracy. No longer a republic, we lose our republic. If we have an authoritarian leader or a dictator, we are not then a democracy. So we are in this window of time where we did great things to vote in this past election. Whomever you voted for, whether you went to the polls on the day appointed and stood in line, or whether you mailed in a ballot, whatever you were doing to take yourself into that space to exercise your right to vote, you had a right to vote. We have hundreds of years of the fight for the right to vote. Women have been fought for the right to vote beginning in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. It went down on the record at that point. There were other women in other spaces already talking about women's rights before 1848, but there's this particular focus that begins to be pushed and doesn't come to fruition until the 19th Amendment is voted on in 1919 and ratified in 1920 and becomes the law. On the other hand, people of color in this country were disenfranchised from the beginning, and then there was ongoing push, and men were technically enfranchised at one point, but not women of color. And then this whole ongoing space, and then as women became enfranchised in general, depended on where you lived and what was going on, so that we come all the way into the 1960s with the fight for the vote for those of color, particularly for African Americans in the United States. John Lewis lived his whole life. He died this past summer, but he lived his whole life fighting that fight, fighting that good fight, arrested over 40 times in his youth, beginning at age 14 and age 17 to get involved in the movement and begin fighting for the right to vote. And part of that voting rights legislation that happens in 1965 under Lyndon B. Johnson, and that push, because millions and millions of people of color and millions of their, there weren't millions of allies, but there were allies. So both Black activists and white allies, and large numbers of Black activists and smaller numbers of white allies fought for that moment in history. And John Lewis eventually ends up a representative in the United States Congress and spends 30-some years in that space, and then dies this past summer. And then Georgia is voting, his home state, and it's voting. And Stacey Abrams does a tremendous amount of work to get voters enfranchised, specifically voters of color in Georgia, and lots of pushback trying to disenfranchise people that she got registered, and just this ongoing contest. And then Georgia, people voted, and it changed the outcome for the nation. It changed the outcome for the presidency and for the Senate. And immediately now, the governor of Georgia has signed. Within a day's time this past week, they put through the Republican-controlled state House and the Republican-controlled state Senate, the voter suppression acts then signed into law by the governor a few days ago, by Kemp a few days ago. And those laws that they pushed through and signed now in Georgia make it harder to vote, make fewer voting places, make the polls open fewer hours, closing them into people would get off work, closing in the 5 p.m. hour, make it a crime to give food or snacks to people waiting in long lines to vote, just making it much more difficult to get to vote by mail, or to in any way, be able to access the vote freely and fairly. And the attempt is to disenfranchise voters, to suppress voters. No one should be winning elections in a democracy by suppressing the vote. It's been going on for decades. It's been going on with gerrymandering. It's been going on with the money being allowed to be funneled behind the scenes to our politicians, with politicians being bought and paid for by what they're calling dark money, as in unilluminated. The Citizens United ruling of the US Supreme Court of 2010 allowed those who allowed politicians to receive money from unaccounted for sources in unimaginable amounts of money, whereas before you had to have small donors that were named, small amounts of donations, and from named donors. And now, it's been more than 10 years of secret monies funneling into our politics. And you see the outcome of this, but it's not just Georgia. It's state after state after state. And the most egregious part of the Georgia bill, and that's part of the bills in many of these other states, is a piece that allows that if the Republican-led state legislature, the state House and Senate, disagree with the legitimate count of the voters of Georgia, that Republican-dominated body will be able to just ignore what the voters voted for, whatever that may be, and declare the winners themselves. That's not elections. That's no longer an election. There was talk of it this past electoral season in Pennsylvania, where I live. There was talk coming out from, the Pennsylvania state legislature is also Republican dominated, and there was talk about them just simply striking the votes of Pennsylvanians, that if Biden carried Pennsylvania, that they would simply strike that, overturn it, and declare it for Trump. It didn't happen, but it came close. And that vote, that law just signed into place in Georgia, will make that an absolute truth. It will make it what happens in 2022, less than 2 years from now, when there's the midterm elections, and it would make it true in 2024. There is currently a federal Congressional House of Representatives bill, H.R. 1, that has gone to the Senate and needs to be voted upon by the Senate. H.R. 1 would strike down all of these voter suppression efforts, all the gerrymandering and all of the legislatures being able to throw out the votes of the people. If we can't vote, if my vote as a citizen isn't counted, if I lose, I lose. If my candidate loses, they lose. But count my vote and count your vote and give us the actual tally, which they did. We had the most voted in and the most overcounted election ever, and honorably, we know who won. In every one of the spaces, we know who won. We know how those votes carried. We know they were counted and counted honorably. We know over 60 lawsuits throughout the claims of voters, theft. It's not true, right? All of that doesn't actually happen. What actually happens is politicians try to suppress the vote of those they don't believe are on their side, try to suppress the vote of people of color, try to suppress the youth in the college vote, try to make it more difficult for students to vote because of where, are they at school at the time of the election? Are they home? Are they registered at their parents' address? Are they registered at their school address? Are they allowed to be registered at their school address? Where do you go to vote if you're registered at the school? All sorts of issues, people being thrown off the voter rolls, all kinds of ways to suppress the votes of people that are perceived to be those who would vote more Democratic than Republican. And it's been going on for a while now, certainly for more than 10 years and even longer, but there's been really egregious violations over these 10 years. I want you to do everything in your power to call, to write your senators about the Senate bill, to ask them to pass the bill S1 that would guarantee our voting rights, that would strike down these unconstitutional and illegal laws that are being passed in these states to suppress the vote, and that would stand up for the vote of the American people. There's also a John Lewis voting rights bill coming through from the House to the Senate that actually puts the teeth back in. So the voting rights legislation of 1965 had an enforcement mechanism. States that were part of the historic Confederacy and that had become Jim Crow states immediately as Reconstruction ends after the Civil War, those states that had suppressed Black votes for decades were forced to not be allowed, were put under the voting rights law. They couldn't change their state laws without checking at the federal level to make sure they weren't violating the civil rights and the voting rights of those in those states, of everybody in those states, including people of color. That enforcement mechanism was taken out of the Voting Rights Act by Shelby County versus Holder and that SCOTUS ruling. And so the John Lewis Voting Rights Act would reinforce, would put an enforcement mechanism back in to protect the votes of American citizens. Every American citizen has a right to vote, and it should be one voter, one vote, no gerrymandering, no suppression, none of the laws meant to make it harder. In a pandemic, it was totally reasonable to vote by mail. And in a pandemic before the post office was intentionally messed with, they delivered just fine. I took my ballot, my ballot came by mail. I did not want to catch COVID. And so I, wearing double masks, went to the drop box and put it inside a drop box that was being guarded. And there was an online way to follow. And I took it shortly before 4:30, and at 4:30, it and all of the things in the locked container into which I slipped my ballot were all carried down to the same place I could have mailed it to in Philadelphia County, and they were taken down and it was registered. And they weren't allowed to count it because of other machinations until after the polls closed, but it told me online that they had received it, and then they counted it after. And Pennsylvania took a while to count because there were Republicans who made sure that they couldn't begin counting the mail-in vote or any kind of early vote before the polls closed, which made it take longer. So I'm asking you to call. I'm asking you to stand up for your right to vote, for my right to vote, for everyone's right to vote, for every US citizen to have the right to vote. It's really, really important. If this doesn't happen, we are no more. We are no more. We would be something entirely different, even if as a nation we maintain the same name. And your ancestors and mine have fought for generations for the right to vote. Initially, only propertied white males were permitted to vote. It's been a long, hard fight, even to get white males who didn't have property to be able to have the right to vote. We all deserve the right to vote, every one of us in these United States. And without the right to vote, we are no longer that. I want to take just a moment and look at our COVID statistics. So there's been a lot of talk about it getting better. And it is getting better. Many people are getting vaccinated, and that vaccination is bringing down the rates. I've been blessed enough to now be 2 weeks past my second dose. And so I am fully vaccinated either now or next week. It's a little unclear whether it's 14 days or 21. I'm going to be really careful anyway. And so, but I've been there and gotten it, and I'm blessed to have received the vaccine. It's an amazing and wondrous thing. And it has really high effectiveness rates, and it is not a problem. I'm not going to grow horns 3 years from now because I got vaccinated. And this technology was being worked on. The scientists are telling us they were working on an mRNA vaccine and that technology for delivering a vaccine for a good decade before this pandemic hit, because they knew pandemics would hit. Part of the news this week has also been that former CDC Director Dr. Redfield, has made the statement he believes that this was manufactured in a lab as part of gain-of-function research and that it accidentally got out. I have no way to answer the question of whether it crossed spontaneously from a bat to a human, or whatever that animal progression to human would have been, or whether or not. I do know that we have decades of the development of biological warfare weapons, and I know that we also have, that there may be some scientists may believe there are legitimate reasons to be increasing the functionality of a virus as part of studying it and part of developing something against it. I am relatively confident that it was not an intentional release. If he happens to be right, and he may not be right, I have no expertise with which to weigh in on that issue. What I do know is that that has nothing to do with any individual Asian American or Asian in the world. That it has nothing, that if there was some kind of a lab connection to this pandemic that we've all been suffering through, it nevertheless has nothing to do with individual human beings who are my brothers and my sisters, period. Whether in the US or not in the US, whether citizens of the US or undocumented immigrants, no matter who, there is every other human being is legitimate, is a legal human being, and deserves respect and good treatment and the right to try to live their life the best way that they can. So don't let Dr. Redfield's statement, whether he's right or wrong, don't let it shake you. It's got nothing to do with the person down the street from you or the neighbor across the hall. It has nothing to do, there's no reason, no justification for hate crimes. And there's been an egregious increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans. Asian Americans are afflicted in our country by two kinds of stereotypes in particular that spring to mind. There may be more that I'm spacing out on right now, but they are all labeled as the model minority in a way that's meant to create strife between one minority group and other minority groups. That's meant to make other people be pissed off about it. And also there is the perpetual foreigner stereotype in the United States that anybody of Asian descent is, like, where are you from? Like you're not from here. And yet their families may have been here. Their family background, their family tree may have been here for generation after generation after generation. Certainly as long as my Irish ancestors are likely to have been here, or my Germanic ancestors are like, well, I know when they came, they didn't come very long ago at all. Both of my mother's parents were immigrants. And she was born here, but her older brother was not. So even one of her siblings was an immigrant, right? And so there's just, and there are Asian Americans whose families have been here for generation after generation after generation. And that perpetual foreigner stereotype is erroneous and detrimental. So when you meet someone who looks to you in your mind, fits the description of whatever you consider. And we put all kinds of different groups under the title Asian in the United States. We have this way of renaming people groups and putting them under umbrella names, like, as if we have the right to do that. And we do it also for our census records. But in the doing of that, whoever we meet, they really have been here much longer than your people. You need to let that sink in, and you need to treat every other human being with respect. May we do that. But in light of the pandemic, and there have been other pandemics in human history that would have had nothing to do with lab creation, right? So, not an answerable question from where you or I stand, but there have been pandemic after pandemics. There have been many pandemics in human history, 3 within the 20th century. So this one, the globe has now had of cases, diagnosed cases, people who had a test and got a test and the test came back positive, is at, these numbers are getting too big for me to read, 127,647,925, which is an increase this week over last week of almost 4 million more cases. 3,900,000 and some. And that's a daily increase of over 565,000. Think about that. That's 565,000 new diagnoses, new infections diagnosed per day. And every one of those human beings is a human being. In the United States, we have now hit almost 40 million cases, 39,933,275, which is an increase this week alone. So the rates are down, but they haven't stopped. It is down to 9 million. So There were an additional 9,445,862 diagnosed cases this week in the US, which is an increase per day of diagnosed cases of 1,349,000 cases diagnosed. As states go maskless, as states remove restrictions, as new variants spring abroad in the land. Last week, the announcement was that by the end of this week, where we now are, that almost all of the new cases in my region of the country, in the northeastern part of the United States, would be coming from the British variant, which is twice as infectious and they believe more deadly. This is not good news. And there are still many, many people not vaccinated, and many people only with one dose so far, not having had their second. So, and we haven't even begun to vaccinate our children. And while children have thus far been less likely to be harmed, we don't know how that stands as different variants come. And unmasked states are likely to increase the new variants, to make new variations. It allows, when you have something beginning to be controlled and then you take the restriction off, it allows new variants to spring up. In the globe, the death toll now from COVID-19 is at almost 3 million. It is 2,793,096 souls who are no longer with us in this 1 year's time. Almost 3 million. That was an increase of death this week of 68,000 more human beings who died around the world, which was almost 10,000 a day. In the United States, according to ENCODE 2019.live, the COVID tracker I've been using for consistency, the same one all along, the death toll in the US is 562,150 souls. That's an increase this week of 7,205, which is an average of 1,029 a day. I'm not taking the highest day, I'm averaging out the increase over the week. So it is a great feeling to be vaccinated. There's a sense of peace of mind. I feel more relaxed. It's Passover this week as well. We began a year ago this time at Passover talking about, and I talked about Passover, and in our meditation used the Passover metaphor as a way of seeing ourselves live through this, you and yours and me and mine, as a way of anchoring our faith to something, to an image, to a metaphor, of making it through, of living through this whole and well and strong. It's been a hard, long year. And the fatigue of it is really getting old. And I knew when it started based on other pandemics of the past and the fact that we didn't at that point have a vaccine and we didn't at that point have any test, or we had rejected the WHO test, the World Health Organization test, and we're trying to make our own. And there's just the space we were in. We were being given initially even less than they had in 1918 and 19 for that pandemic. They had masks, we've added masks. First we said no masks. And I'm like, why? You know, from the beginning, it's like, if it protects the nerves, it would help me a little bit. I can make one out of my t-shirt, like, don't stop me from making a mask. I wasn't going to go take an N95 from a nurse, but you know, they really needed that good mask, but I needed something. And so, you know, I hooked up my own, and people finally began to, the advice got there, right? First, it was just hand washing. And then finally it's like, no, this is coming out in our breath. It's not just coughing, sneezing, heavy droplets that fall to the ground and land on surfaces, get touched by our hands and get carried to our face. No, this is airborne and it goes out. When I breathe, my breath actually extends out over a few minutes time to a distance of 20 or 30 feet away from me. And all the tiny droplets are suspended in that breath. Aerosolization is not the heavy droplets. It's this light stuff that just kind of floats and doesn't, and just stays there to get in people's eyes, nose, mouth. The reason we should wear face coverings. Maybe even a face shield, depending on what you're doing. I wore one to my shot. Two times I wore one. But, and wearing a mask. And so we got there. We got to the masking and the hand washing. And that's what they had in 1918, and social distancing, physical distancing. When they disobeyed that, Philadelphia disobeyed it for a Liberty Bond parade, and 100,000 people were in the hospital within days. And so COVID, that influenza virus in 1918 and 19 and 20 killed more rapidly than COVID, but COVID has been a horrible way to die. And COVID's a weird thing. Some people don't get sick at all. They get it and they're asymptomatic. Other people get it and they get badly sick, but they get well. Other people get it and they get sick, but they never really quite get well. And other people get it and die, right? There's been a whole range of responses to it. And while they've been like, oh, it's killing old people, it's also killed some younger people. It's also harmed long range some younger people. It hasn't been. In fact, over the past few months, the average age of the hospitalized COVID patient, even in an ICU, has been much younger. It's been more in their 50s, in their 40s, not 80s, right? So there's been some real shifts in the populations being affected, in part because, our older populations, we did begin to protect them, and we did begin to be more careful with nursing homes and long-term care facilities and hospitals, and we began to, vaccinate them first, along with the doctors and the nurses. So we've been making some changes. But there's another holiday coming up, and spring break just passed. People were all over the place partying for spring break, and other places where they were burning masks, and other states that have lifted the mandates. And so there's almost no way for that not to spike again. The monoclonal antibody treatments appear to be good. They appear to be effective and helpful. And our vaccines at present appear to be good protection. If you have the opportunity to get a vaccine, I strongly recommend you follow the science and do so. But you're a free human being, and so you'll make your own decision. But back to our space. We were envisioning a blue wave last year this time in the summer. We were, right now, the trial of Derek Chauvin is going on for the murder, for the absolute lynching death of George Floyd, because lynching is not simply hanging. Lynching is extrajudicial killing, murdering someone without a trial, without a judge, without a jury, without arrest, without charges, without conviction, just taking it in your own hands. It's a vigilante form of violence, and that police officer in front of our eyes did this thing. So his trial is going on. And here we are, as we sit here in this space, all last spring and summer, I guess it was really summer because it was more Memorial Day. I was got a Memorial Day and Labor Day mixed up in my head. But anyway, there was a lot of activism, a lot of raising voices, a lot of protests. There are presently a lot of voices being raised about the anti-Asian American violence that's been happening. There are voices being raised about voter suppression that's so egregious it would effectively end our democracy. There's a lot of things going on. There is still the need to find out who did what at the Capitol. I had to teach a film on a neo-Nazi and in background information for that, and looking into the ideologies of various groups. Clearly, there are those out there who intended an overthrow of the US government that day and who intended still. I'm as like government leave me alone as anybody else is, but on the other hand, the fact that there is an order and a system that has not been historically totally autocratic and authoritarian is a plus. The fact that there's been a system in which we could fight for rights. And part of my dissertation research into social movements, one of the important things that I came to realize in my studies and that, studying the theories of social movement scholars was that in countries where the repression is heavy enough, then there has to be revolt, rebellion, revolution, armed revolution. But in a place where there's enough freedom, there's error, but there's also freedom, then the people can make a movement. And America has been the site of historic movements, abolition, labor movements, Black civil rights movements, and Black justice and power movements, and women's rights movements, 3 different waves or 4, or whatever we're counting at now, and gay rights movements, and just movements for social justice. And the thing about those movements is there was enough liberty that the likelihood of being killed while standing up for your rights was relatively low. Not that they didn't shoot white students at Kent State University in 1970 for protesting against the war in Vietnam, not that they haven't shot at and used live ammunition on Indigenous people standing up for the right to clean water and the right not to have the pipeline pollute their areas and tear up their sacred lands, or not that there haven't been people shot protesting against harm against unarmed African Americans by police forces. There have been, but the overall space has been there for social movements in the United States. And that is to me the best part of us. So we began to envision a blue wave. And it's not about corporate Democrats. It's about envisioning an America in which our issues are addressed. We're here now, and we owe the ancestors, and we certainly owe our descendants. So we need to stand for voting rights. We need to stand for both Senate Bill 1, and we need to stand for the John Lewis Voter Rights Act. We need to stand for the passage of the Anti-Lynching Act. We need to stand for the Equal Rights Amendment. We need to stand for $15 minimum wage. Isn't even enough now, and it's not going to be enough when we get there, but we need to stand for an expansion of the minimum wage. We need to stand for the right of laborers to gather in unions and to organize and to collectively protest. It's been a great source of power to the American worker across these 2 centuries. We're almost coming up there. It starts about 1830, really, the American labor movement, and we're just shy of 2030. We need to stand for the expansion of healthcare access to all by some means or another, by a public option or by Medicare for all or something. We need to stand for a lot of the people who haven't gotten benefit from the Affordable Care Act. It was because their governors refused, often Republican governors, refused the Medicaid expansion provision in that law. And so therefore it didn't help. It didn't do anything good, right? You needed that. And we also have to have where they're taking your income and they're making they're helping with that. And that was what when it works right in a state where it works right, that's what the Affordable Care Act can provide. Do it by calling the person on the phone. The websites have been hard to deal with. And we need a space in which overthrow of government is not what we want. I know someone who's from a nation that's seen civil war, and she's like, Americans don't know. We don't want civil war, and we don't want the overthrow of our government. And actually, we don't want a white ethno-state. We want a democracy with the chance for each of us, with the inalienable rights of each of us undergirded. So I would like you to help me continue to picture the America that our ancestors have fought for, and presuming your ancestors fought for civil rights, not against. And I'm asking you to continue to envision that blue wave sweeping through, the removal from leadership and from positions of power of those who would suppress the votes, the removal of those who have taken illicit money behind the scenes and been bought and paid for and are not representing their constituents, but are instead representing those who have paid their bills. I'm asking you to believe for an America in which there's healthcare, in which there's a living wage, in which there's the opportunity for each and every one of us. And I'm asking you to envision with me an America and globe in which the pandemic ends. We really have the strong opportunity for that in these vaccines. We have need of this thing coming to an end. We also need to be ready to be wise for the duration. I know spring and summer should still be places in which, spaces of time, in which you and I continue to be careful. We have to see what the variants are doing. We have to see if our vaccines hold against those variants. We have to get the bulk of the population vaccinated. It's not time yet to let your guard down, but it could be time to hug a child. So just taking a moment. Take a moment and visualize light surrounding you. I've talked before about a beam of light coming down from the source of all, however you conceive it to be, whether it's the universe or God or whatever image of the divine or of the beginnings, the origins you may have. Just take a moment and picture yourself ensconced, enwrapped, enveloped in the beam of light coming down upon you with the kind of tractor beam that shines down from above on the actor on the stage. And inside of that light with you, see those you love and need the most. Your children, grandchildren, siblings, spouse, mother, father, grandparents, aunts, uncles, extended family members, close friends, loved ones, those whomever, however you define them, those you love and need the most. And see that beam of light become a force field of energy that bounces off everything that would come against you and yours, inside your circle of light and protection. And in this space, envision that you abide in an America that is ever increasingly living up to its vision of its best, increasingly living up to the vision of its pretty words in the Declaration and in the Constitution, living up to the space of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness and inalienable rights. And see that space, see democracy, see your right to protest and your right to vote and your right to freedom of speech and your right to a free press. See your right to freedom of religion and from religion. See your rights undergirded, supported, established, continuing. And envision with me that every leader at every level, local, state, and national, is a person of character who is there to serve their constituents, there to serve the people to the best of their abilities. Not there to enforce their own belief systems on others, not there to violate the separation of church and state, and not there to steal and underhandedly back big donors. See corruption removed from our politics, however hard that may be to envision. Struggle with me to envision a space, a political space free of corruption. Some nations fund the campaigns or have ways in which those who are campaigning can receive public funding for those campaigns. See a space in which our politicians are not bought and paid for, but are answerable to we the people. And just in this moment, see the needs of immigrants, refugees and asylum seekers met, children restored to them, but also given a path forward into a life free of the likelihood of death and destruction in their home country. See a path to citizenship for all of those here working, contributing. See a free, fair, and just and real America, the one you were always told we have, and see it all the way through. See governments of the world responding to the needs of the climate, of the globe, of the environment, and making real and dramatic change immediately. And just for a moment, add into this space whatever else you need. The money, the food, the rent, the mortgage, everything you need to get through, to survive, and to once again prosper. And as you come back, just allow yourself to hold that feeling of America being all America says it is. Be strong, be well. Till next week when it's actually Easter. Happy Passover. May this pandemic and all of these other egregious ills pass over you and yours, and me and mine, and our countries.